Hey, in this video I want to help you to find the right video camera for every budget. It's October 2021 right now, and I don't think that the video camera market will change a lot over the next year, so the advice from this video should be valid until the end of 2022 or even longer. And I will go through 4 different budget categories here in this video. The first one, low budget, then mid-range, semi-professional and professional. So depending on your budget, you can just look into the timeline. There I will have sections for each budget, and you can just skip to that so that you know what camera is best for you. But first let me show you a shot I got recently together with my logo animation, because I really like my logo animation. Come on, it looks good. Okay, let's start with the low budget segment below $1,000, and here I got 3 cameras that I would say are the best, but also a few more that are worth mentioning. And I would say let's start with the ZV-E10 here from Sony, because that's overall the best budget 4K option. You can either get it for $798 together with the kit lens, which I would actually recommend. I think for beginners it's a pretty good starting set. And you can also get it for a bit cheaper for $698 without a lens, so then you can choose a lens by yourself. There's actually a strength of this camera because you can attach all the Sony E-mount lenses for it, like E-mount and also FE lenses, which are full frame, and that allows you to already invest into lenses in case you want to upgrade to a full frame camera or a more expensive APS-C camera later, and that's pretty strong with this system. Like other systems, it's always a bit more complicated. It also offers 4K resolution up to 30 frames per second, which is definitely great, but it has like 2 downsides. The first one is that if you want to activate the internal stabilization of this camera, you have a pretty significant crop, so your image gets a bit tighter. Then it can, for example, be an issue if you want to vlog, then it feels a bit too close to your face. And that's also why I recommend getting it with a kit lens, because the kit lens comes with optical image stabilization, so you don't need the digital image stabilization if you want to vlog, and actually a lens is wide enough to shoot your own face. And also great about this camera is the autofocus. I think as a beginner, especially if you want to film yourself a lot for YouTube or other social media platforms, that's good to have. Aside from that, the only real issue that I have with this camera is the rolling shutter. It's like when you pan the camera around, then always straight lines get a bit banded, and that looks pretty weird. I don't like that really, but aside from that, it's a really good entry-level camera. And our next camera is the Canon M6 Mark II, which I actually used quite a lot last year, and I would say that this is the best overall camera for run and gun, but also stationary footage, because it also has really good autofocus. It also offers 4K up to 30 frames per second, and actually if you want to stabilize the footage from the Canon M6 Mark II, it crops in less as on the Sony ZV-E10, so it's a bit better sometimes for vlogging or if you want to get wide angle shots that are stabilized, and you can also then use lenses with it that are not stabilized without cropping too much into the image. And the video quality of the Canon M6 Mark II is also really good. It is a bit softer as the ZV-E10 though, because it doesn't read every pixel from the sensor, but I actually found this image quite pleasing. It's not really an ugly softness. It kind of does something. I liked it, and it has Canon color science, and Canon colors just look beautiful straight out of camera. I would actually say that the Canon M6 Mark II is the camera that I would recommend to most YouTubers or beginner content creators because of all the advantages that I mentioned before. But then there's also another camera that I reviewed last year, and that's the Fujifilm X-S10. And the Fujifilm X-S10 is also a bit unique because it's the only camera from these 3 best cameras that comes with inbuilt sensor stabilization, so that means that you get stabilized video without any crop. That's good for vlogging, obviously. There's also a kit lens, the 15 to 45 millimeter. It's good for vlogging. There you really get the full field of view while it's stabilized, so that's great. Overall, the only downside of the Fujifilm X-S10 is really that the autofocus is not as good as the autofocus from the ZV-E10 or the Canon M6 Mark II, but it's actually not bad. You just have to really set the settings on this camera to the fastest, and you have to keep the focus point on your face, and then it actually works pretty good. So it's overall a really good camera, and yeah, it would likely be my choice right now if I really have a budget of only $1,000. So that are my favorite budget cameras, but there are also 3 more that are worth mentioning. At first, the Canon M50, because it's super cheap. It comes at $649 including the kit lens. Autofocus is decent, but the problem with this camera is that the 4K crop is insane, so it's not really usable for 4K, I would say, and that's why I would only say it's a 1080p camera. If you have a little bit more money to spend, I would go for a ZV-E10 or a Canon M6 Mark II instead. But if you're really completely on a budget and you really need a camera, then the Canon M50 is good to start out for shooting video. Then there are also 2 cameras from Panasonic. The first one is the G95 and the other one is the G9. And both the Panasonic G95 and G9 also come with sensor stabilization, and Panasonic has one of the best sensor stabilization on the market, so you get really stable footage straight out of your hands. And Panasonic generally has the problem that the autofocus sucks, which doesn't mean that you can't use it. It's like you can press the AF on button, it locks on a subject and the focus stays where it is. That works actually pretty good with these cameras, but the autofocus doesn't track your face or anything like that, or you can expect that it will lose your face and then the focus will hunt. But if you are mostly behind the camera and you film other stuff, then these are actually pretty good options, especially the Panasonic G9, because it comes with 4K 60 frames per second, so you can do slow motion in 4K with it, and it also has 10-bit recording, which helps a lot with color grading. It's a bit more professional already, but well, if you're really passionate about videography and you're on a budget, then that can actually be a pretty good option. And the G95 has overall pretty good video quality, but it doesn't have 4K 60 or 10-bit, but I used the predecessor, the G85, for about a year, and I was really happy with the footage always, and that's why I also want to recommend this camera here. Okay, but now it gets a bit more interesting already. Let's come to the mid-range. I also have 3 favorite cameras there and also a few more that are worth mentioning. And I would say let's start with my overall favorite camera in that price range, and that is the Fujifilm X-T4, which I used last year a lot, and I made a ton of videos about it. Maybe you know me from these videos already. And the Fujifilm X-T4 is great because it ticks most of the boxes for a great video camera. It's just the autofocus could be a little bit better, but it's absolutely usable. But aside from that, you have 4K 60 frames per second again, so slow motion in 4K. You have 10-bit recording also in 4K 60, so really good for color grading. And apart from that, it also has decent dynamic range, so you can see a lot of detail in the highlights in the sky and so on, while you also see a lot in the shadows, which many cheaper cameras don't do. And it is also pretty good in low light. I actually found it better in low light as the Canon EOS R, which is a full frame camera, and the Fujifilm X-T4 is an APS-C camera, so the sensor is a bit smaller. But the X-T4 really shows that smaller sensor doesn't necessarily mean that the camera is bad. And the Fujifilm X-T4 also comes with inbuilt sensor stabilization, which actually worked pretty good. It was a bit laggy at first, but then they fixed it via a firmware upgrade, and I was actually really happy with it. So also great if you don't want to crop in for stabilization, but you can also do that. You can actually combine digital image stabilization and sensor stabilization in this camera, which actually gives you really good, so really stable footage straight out of your hands. So if you're looking for a camera between $1,000 and $2,000, then the Fujifilm X-T4 is definitely a camera that you should look into. And the other 2 favorite cameras in that segment are actually full frame cameras. The first one is the Panasonic S5, which is really good for video actually, but it has the same downside as the other Panasonic cameras that I mentioned before, and that is the bad autofocus. But aside from that, really good camera. It has 10-bit for color grading, it has 4K 60 FPS, and it's also really good for photography if you want to do both. So that's probably a camera that you want to look into if you don't have to film yourself a lot, which you can also do. You can always lock the focus on your face. You just don't have to move forward and backward all the time, because otherwise you get out of focus. But it is also usable for that, and for that price it's actually a really good offer. And the other camera or cameras that I can recommend here in that segment is the Sony a7C and the Sony a7 III. Now both cameras don't have 4K 60 FPS, they only have 4K up to 30 frames per second, and they also don't have 10-bit, so for color grading it's a little bit more complicated as on the Fujifilm X-T4 and the Panasonic S5. but still I must say I use the A7C a lot. I shoot a lot in S-Log3 to get the full dynamic range. I color grade the footage, and usually the footage from outside looks really good, but when I shoot inside, oftentimes in the shadows, I get a bit of artifacting and so on, so then it's not that nice anymore. But overall, really good cameras, really good options for full frame, maybe also if you want to do some photography. But even if both cameras don't have these incredible video features, they offer really good autofocus, and that's great for me because the A7C is actually my second camera, and that is oftentimes just there to have a second angle, and there I don't need really the craziest video features. Just having a camera with good autofocus there is good enough, and the A7C does a good job there. I would overall recommend the A7C for video over the A7 III because it has a flip screen at first, and it also has the new Sony color science, what leads to better skin tones, and skin tones are always really important. And it also comes with the new hot shoe multi-interface mount what Sony has there that allows to attach the special Sony microphones that I really love, especially the ECM B1M microphone has a really good quality, and the A7 III does not have that. Therefore, the A7 III has a proper viewfinder, so that's really good. And the A7C only has this small viewfinder that's pretty much unusable. And that's a bit of a trade-off because especially in bright sunlights, it's always good to have a proper viewfinder. But overall, for me, the flip screen and the better color science overweight. So if you're looking into a good camera, they are both priced the same at the moment, then just get the A7C despite if you need a good viewfinder. But of course, there are also a few other cameras that are worth mentioning here. The Panasonic GH5, which I used for 2 years. It's a really good budget option at $2,300 around. It also has 4K 60 frames per second. It has 10-bit. You can record via an external monitor in 4K 60 10-bit 42 ProRes and stuff like that. A really good camera still, but it has a pretty small sensor with a 2x crop. It's similar to the Panasonic G9 and G95. But if you're looking for a bit cheaper camera that has all these professional video options, then it's definitely a camera to look into. But also Panasonic, really bad autofocus. And then there's also the Sony a6600, which has inbuilt sensor stabilization. The GH5 also has that, by the way, but the a6600 doesn't have 4K 60 and 10-bit and so on. You're pretty limited there, but therefore it has pretty good autofocus. So if you want to have sensor stabilization, good autofocus, decent color straight out of camera, but not being able to color grade too much, then it might also be a camera for you. And then there's also the Nikon Z6 Mark II, which is about $2,000 only for the body, no lens. By the way, the other cameras, the GH5 and the a6600, is also body only in this price range. All these cameras are body only, so you have to buy the lens separate. But the Nikon Z6 Mark II also looks like a pretty good camera. I never used Nikon by myself, so I can't say anything about it. But from what I see, that it has 4K 60 recording, it has a 10-bit output at least, no internal recording though. That might also be a camera to look into. As far as I know, the autofocus is not as good as Sony or Canon, but it should also do a pretty good job. And some people might say, hey, what about the Canon EOS R? And I must clearly say I can't recommend this camera anymore, even if it's not bad, because it's pretty much only a 1080p camera. And I think in that price range, buying only a 1080p camera, even if it overall has good colors and good autofocus or so on, it's really not worth it. A7C overall has pretty much the same features as Canon EOS R, but it does not have this 4K crop, so you also get a good 4K camera here. But let's come to these semi-professional cameras now, and what you probably noticed is that it comes down to cameras that have really good video specs like 4K 60, 10-bit and internal stabilization, but the autofocus is not that good. And then you have cameras like A7C or so that have great autofocus, but the video specs are pretty standard, like 4K up to 30 frames per second in 8-bit and so on, so it's a bit weaker there. And now where we get into the semi-professional and professional market, there we have less and less of these limitations. So in the semi-professional market, my favorite camera right now would be the Canon R6 actually, because there is the Sony a7 IV that enters the market soon, but it's not there yet. So I think when the Sony a7 IV comes out, that will blow all other cameras away in that price range, because the rumors for the Sony a7 IV and what's by the technology that Sony has and by the market is pretty much confirmed already, is that it will have 4K 60 again in 10-bit 4:2, and it will have inbuilt stabilization, and it will have good autofocus. So pretty much nothing to complain there anymore. And it will also not have overheating, which is the only downside really of the Canon R6. The Canon R6 has all these great features, great autofocus, 4K 60, 10-bit, blah blah blah, but it overheats after about 45 minutes, which can be a problem sometimes if you want to shoot longer interviews or so. So that's like really the only trade-off there of the Canon R6. And aside from that, there's only one other camera actually in the semi-professional market that I would recommend, and that is the Panasonic S1. But yeah, I would not really recommend it because there's a Panasonic S5, and the S1 has pretty much the same specs, just some other features like HDMI and so on is a bit better. But I think overall that I would save $500 there and go for the S5. Like the S1 overall, it's also 4K 60 with a crop, it has 10-bit recording, the autofocus success from all Panasonic cameras, but it has great inbuilt stabilization. So overall in that price segment right now, I would go for the Canon R6, but as soon as the A7 IV comes out, I think there's no other camera to look into really if you want to get a camera below $3,000. But now let's come to the professional cameras, and that is really where you have to make the least amount of compromises. And my absolute favorite camera there is the camera that I'm shooting on right now, the Sony a7S III. Reason is simply that there is no compromise anymore. We have 4K 120p, so insane slow motion. We have all of that in 10-bit 4:2, and I also have great inbuilt stabilization with this camera. Also, there's no overheating, like it never overheated on me. I shoot 4K 120 a lot. I shoot pretty long sessions when I talk to the camera. It never overheated. If there's one compromise in this camera, then that is the 12 megapixels of the sensor, which is not really a compromise for video, because for video it's usually better to have lower but bigger pixels, so lower megapixel count and bigger pixels, because it gives you better low light and dynamic range. But if you also want to use this camera for photography and you want to print your photos or you want to crop in a lot, then it can be an issue. But to be honest, I shot photo time lapses on this camera, I shot many YouTube thumbnails on this camera, and I was always really happy with the result. And you can also upscale the photos in Photoshop. It has this, I don't even know what it's called, I don't use Photoshop by myself, but there's this upscaling options that via AI calculate some new pixels and suddenly your image is high res, like 4 times the resolution or so. So it's really not an issue of this camera, and that's why I think that this is overall the least compromised camera of all so far. There's also the Sony A1, which is like twice as expensive. There you get 8K video, better photo options at 50 megapixels, and yeah, also 4K 120 and so on. So that's probably also a camera that you should look into, but it doesn't have a flip screen, and this is actually a deal breaker for me. I always want to have a flip screen. But of course, there are also other cameras in that price range. Probably the closest is the Canon R5, which is actually overall in its specs very similar to the Sony a7S III, but it has also, what has it, 50 megapixels I think, or 48 or something like that. So it is better for photography, but the Canon R5 has the issue that it can overheat depending on how long you shoot and in what modes and so on. So depending on the kind of video work that you want to do, it might not be the ideal camera. But overall, I know people that are very happy with the Canon EOS R5, so that is definitely a camera worth mentioning here. And yeah, these are basically the 2 professional cameras that I would recommend here, or 3. I also mentioned the Sony A1. There's also the Canon R3 that recently came out, which looks like a bigger version of the Canon R5, but with a 20 megapixel sensor and less overheating issues. So I would say if you're more into hybrid shooting, into photography and videography, and 20 megapixels are enough, maybe you're a sports photographer or so on, then that is also an interesting camera to look into. But these are really all the professional options here. Of course, there are more cameras, like cinema cameras, especially Sony FX6, for example, FX9 and so on, and Red Komodo. But to be honest, I'm not a cinema camera shooter. I don't have any experience with these cameras. That's why I'm not talking about that here. But these are all my recommendations for mirrorless cameras. So if I would have to choose one camera that I would recommend for most people for each category, then that would be the Canon M6 Mark II, clearly for the low budget category. Then in the mid-range one, that would be the Fujifilm X-T4. In the semi-professional one from the camera that exists right now, the Canon R6, but likely soon the Sony a7 IV, and in the professional category, clearly the Sony a7S III or FX3. It's pretty much the same camera, just a different body. But of course, what's even more important than your camera is to learn how to shoot with it. So if you want to learn more about that, then just have a look at this video here that I explain you more about videography and how to get good shots. And of course, make sure to hit subscribe and the like button if you enjoyed this video and if it was helpful. That helps my channel grow, and I hope to see you in the next video.